in week 3 of our series, Imperfect Family. I'm a perfect father. Just ask my kids and just take notes for the next 45 minutes or so while they tell you how that's not true. But the reality is that God gives us the tools that we need to take our imperfect people, put them into a home together, and continue to become more and more like Jesus. So as we begin today's talk, I just want to maybe step into our time machine for a moment and take us back to maybe a happier moment in time. I believe by the next few audio moments, we can teleport you back to the living room that you grew up in, watching some of these maybe famous sitcoms. Maybe you recognize this one.
Here's the story.
Sing along, anyone?
A lovely lady.
Not saying anything mean, but those are older voices singing. I'm just saying facts. It's the Brady Bunch. If you grew up listening to the Brady Bunch, the family, blended family, quite an ordeal. Sometimes it was funny. Sometimes it was, no, I'm just moving on. Maybe a little bit younger generation. Maybe you recognize this family. Look, some of y'all are singing it. We haven't started the words yet. That was bad. Look, oh, okay, that's my people right there. You have people after my own heart. The Fresh Prince, good family story, good sitcom. This one kind of got rebumped here in the last few years, especially with streaming, because now it's got like this kind of Christian undertone to it, which is kind of cool. Like it was just real subtle in there. Maybe you recognize this sitcom. No one, just me. Okay, perfect. It's great. Full House, right? Full House was a good one. Another weird concoction of family in one house. Kind of give us maybe the impression that not only they're recognizable sitcoms, but they were different. Like it was a different kind of home. But for most people, 30 minutes of must-see TV on Mondays and must-see TV on Thursdays and must-see TV Fridays. There was like a reality where we could escape the drama of our own home and kind of become part of a studio fairy tale family or a studio favorite family. All the beauty of the story of a 30-minute sitcom was funny. It made you laugh, maybe made you giggle. But somehow, the family could experience some sort of tragedy, some sort of hardship, and in just 30 minutes or less, they could resolve the whole situation. Now, I don't know about your home, but for me, that was never the case. Never did we find out about some horrific difficulty, and in 30 minutes, problem solved. Cue that credit music. It was crazy. Now, what was most disappointing, especially if you grew up in my generation before there was streaming, and anytime an episode ended, you had to wait till the next 7-day period. There was nothing more disappointing in the course of the week than reading that one little phrase at the end of the episode, right? To be continued. Oh, that would rip your heart out. When adversity came up, when difficulty came up, their goal was to resolve it in one episode. I don't know about for you, but that never happened in my home. That still doesn't happen very often in my home. It seems like we're going to resolve conflict over the course of a season. Or maybe, hopefully, at least resolve it by the end of the series. I don't know about you, but for me, we found out quickly in our marriage and in our home that I grew up in a home where we dealt with conflict in a very unique way and didn't do it very well. And then, lo and behold, if you got married, you got married to someone who dealt with conflict in a very different way than yours. And somehow we thought when we blended these two unions together, it would somehow magically get better. And conflict seems to be this thing that just continually reoccurs. In fact, you might say, rather than being a situational comedy, which I just learned this week is what sitcom stands for, but rather than living out a situational comedy, we live in an ongoing misery when it comes to the conflict of our world. But lo and behold, God's not surprised by who you are and what you bring to the table. In fact, by God's design, fully knowing that the home was made of imperfect people, through the power of His Holy Spirit, God gives us the steps, the power, and the wherewithal to resolve conflicts, I believe, by the end of every episode. By God's design, God has granted you a peace for your home, whatever your home looks like, that is completely different than any peace that the world has to offer. In fact, Jesus speaks very clearly about this. John chapter 14, starting in verse 26, Jesus says this. But when the Father sends the advocate as my representative, and then he describes, that is the Holy Spirit, He will teach you everything and will remind you of everything I've already told you. The next verse, he says, I'm leaving you with a gift, peace of mind and heart. The peace I give is a gift that the world cannot give. God's design for your home, no matter what your home looks like right now, is the peace of Jesus Christ in your home. And then God goes through the scriptures from Genesis to the maps in the back, giving us the instructions to live out this peace. If there was one underlying valuable lesson, I think every sitcom we have ever watched might teach us, I think it's this, it's in your notes. No relationship is immune to conflict. Somewhere along the way, either we've misplaced hope in believing that if a relationship is good, it'll just never have conflict. And we kind of fall into some extremes in that category. We kind of fell into some categories of how we came to that conclusion that conflict is bad for relationships. For some people, maybe you grew up in a home where it was just conflict nonstop, and you just come to the reality to accept that's just what relationships are. Like I watched my parents fight all the time until they finally divorced over conflict, and that's just probably what my relationship's going to be, and that's how my relationship with my kids are going to be, and we're just going to fight all the time. That's the new normal. Or many people, especially in the Christian culture, we determined that we should not conflict, so whenever anger would start to well up inside of me, we're just going to squish that right back down. And we'd isolate ourselves and be very silent and be quiet to ourselves until we realized, okay, I think I'm not expressing as much anger as I was a moment ago, so things must be okay. Or I think where many families actually raised my generation was, we realize that there's conflict, but then we realize that the kids are within earshot or the kids are in the same car. And once one of the parties in the conflict realizes, hey, we need to shut this down to protect the kids. Good intent, right? To protect the kids. But then the kids never got to witness you resolving the conflict or working through your feelings because you went and do it in a closed door room, or you went and did it after the kids maybe went to bed at night, to which now this generation, especially the generation below me, has come to assume that it's okay to start a fight, but we've modeled no healthy resolution or no healthy conflict resolution skills. Can I just offer this little nugget? If your kids see you start a conflict, let your kids see you solve the conflict. Model for them what healthy conflict resolution starts like. No relationship is immune to conflict. In fact, I would offer not only is no relation immune to conflict, the closer you are to people, the more constant conflict has opportunity to present itself. I mean, think about it. Like the people that we let our guard down the most with are usually the ones that are in our home, right? They get to see the ugly side of us more than anybody else. But Jesus gives us this gift, a gift that only he can offer, peace of Christ for your home. And then the Bible gives us really simple steps to walk it out. We'll start with the Bible don'ts, what the Bible says don't do. If you're taking notes, the first don't let anger become sin. Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 26, the first part of it. Paul writes and he says, and don't sin by letting your anger control you. It's not a sign of maturity that you can compress your anger and never get angry. The reality is we are human by nature, and not all anger is in fact sin. Jesus got angry, and he didn't sin. What happens is oftentimes the anger builds up inside of us to a place where we don't deal with it. And when we don't deal with anger, we open the door to sin. Anger is not automatically a sin, but how we handle our anger quickly leads way to become sin, especially with the people we're closest to. No relationship in close proximity will ever be free from anger. But the extremes of how we handle anger is toxic. Either we compress it, we don't talk about it, we don't deal with it, we don't address it, we act like it's not there, toxic. Or we just live in a place of constant anger. We use our anger like a volcano to erupt on people, to manipulate people, to navigate the conversation into a way where I'm the higher power, I'm the higher authority, and will run over people to exponentially damage the relationships that are supposed to be the closest relationships in our life. Now, full disclaimer, sometimes our anger is fully valid. You didn't live up to my expectations. We talked about this last week. But I've clearly communicated to you what my expectations were, and you just didn't do the chore I asked you to do. You just didn't use the words I asked you to use. You didn't step into to the reality of where I was after my long, hard day at work, sit next to me and say, how are you, like I asked you to. And sometimes our anger is validated, but most of our anger is assumed anger. I'll explain. Assumed anger is when I assume that you meant that to be hurtful. Assumed anger is when I assume you ignored my expectations. Assumed anger is when I assume you knew my expectations. Assumed anger is when I assume that you meant to say that to hurt me. Recognizing when we get angry, recognizing why we get angry, it gives us space to do with what we have when we are angry. So when I feel angry bubbling up inside of me, when I feel anger stirring in me, I recognize that's not a bad thing, but I need to understand why and where this is coming from. I need to understand in the moment to have the maturity to understand, like, I need to pause right here in my anger. And maybe I even need to step away, especially if I feel like I'm going to say something that I'll regret and wish I wouldn't have said. Because if I can pause and filter through, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? How am I getting out of bounds? Is there a responsibility or role that I play in my own anger? Because anger is the biggest consumer of our emotional energy. Like if you're training for a marathon, like you understand, you can't just go out tomorrow and run 26 miles. It takes training to build up to it. But we often miss that anger taxes our physical and emotional being more than just about anything else. Being angry and not dealing with it, it will affect our physical person. Studies across the board show that anger, when we don't deal with it, causes high blood pressure. Anger, when we don't deal with it, causes insomnia, causes headaches. Over a long period of time, it weakens our immune system. It creates like an ongoing muscle tension. It's even been linked that when we sit in long periods of anger, that it releases a stress hormone that helps to bring cancer about our body. Anger is a big, big deal. What's the remedy? One of the things the Bible shows us. It's in your notes. Grace-filled honesty. If you remember back in week 1 of the series, we talked about creating a culture in our home as the culture, a Christ-like culture. A Christ-like culture is grace-filled honesty. It's how we take the anger that builds up inside of us, and full of grace, we can be honest about, this is how I feel right now. This is what you said did to me right now. This is where this conversation has been hurtful to me right now. Grace-filled honesty is not permission to word vomit on someone you love and just say, I've got permission to do so. Grace-filled honesty is the honest conversation with the grace that doesn't make it insulting, harmful, or intend to harm. I love how the Passion Translation reads Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6. Let every word you speak be drenched with grace and tempered with truth and clarity. How can we create a culture, a Christ-centered culture of grace-filled honesty in our home if we never are willing to deal with the anger when it shows up in our life? If we can be angry without sinning. If someone can tell me something and I don't fly off the handle, we're building a culture of grace-centered, grace-filled honesty. If I can't say that to them, you know this conversation, I can never tell them that because they will lose their mind. I think we've located the issue. We've got to get to a place where we can have conversations with our loved ones and not lose our stuff over it. Great opportunity to pause in your notes and on our app and on the website or some resources that we add to each week of this series to help you in your imperfect family. I know your family is not as imperfect as mine. I give lots of illustrations so you know what you're compared to. But there's really good resources on there today. A couple books and a resource conflict field guide. Just practical biblical steps of how we resolve conflicts with the people that we care about, the people that we love. What we might need to do is learn to take some feedback that we don't take personal. What we might need to do is implement some outside help to walk us through how not to get so offended when we stir up some passionate anger in our relationships. Maybe something I could do on a healthier basis. Maybe something I could take and not take it as a personal attack. But if we believe that when a loved one comes to me and says, this is what you said and this is how it hurt, and if I take a posture of a Christ-like man and say, you know what, I don't want to hurt you anymore. I don't want to be defensive about what I said. I don't want to be defensive about, maybe it was justified. But if I'm hurtful to you, I don't want to hurt you anymore. So I take a posture of grace-filled honesty. I'll give you an example. Being a pastor, there's really no regular hours. Like, I understand y'all think I only work Sunday mornings. I work a full-time job. And what's worse is like most of the week is like normal working hours. But most of you work normal working hours or you go to school during normal working hours. So when someone wants to talk to one of the pastors, it's usually after hours on the weekend before you go into work in the morning. And that sometimes can be a little bit taxing on a family. When I first got into ministry, Katie would often tell me, you're gone too much. You missed every day this week. You didn't tuck the kids in one time this week. And every time she did, because of the immaturity and the anger in my own heart, I would argue with her. I'm doing the Lord's work. Are you telling me tucking the kids in is more important than that family going through trauma right now? I would argue with her. Look, I am doing what God's called me to do. Are you going to stand in the way of what God has called me to do? No, I need to be here. Finally, I'll never forget the day we sat down. Katie and I sat down, and in a grace-filled, honest conversation, she said, this is what happens when you miss 6 or 7 days in a row with your kids. And she said, I need you to hear, this is what happens to our home when you're gone so much. And with grace-filled honesty, I received the truth that she needed me to hear. And we put a structure, a staple in place that still exists to this day. If ever my schedule, my calendar gets so overwhelmed with every single day, busyness and things going on, and I'm missing out on too many things, church, I'm called to pastor my home before I'm called to pastor this church. Katie has full permission to tell me, you're gone too much, and I will not respond in a mean and hurtful way. I'll respond by changing my calendar to pastor my family. It's having a humble heart to say, you know what, I'm not going to get angry about this. Yes, my response was true. God called me to do a great work, but not at the cost of my family. So we have this permission to be honest. We have a culture where we can be honest and not be offended. It's not going to fix it overnight. If you've ever tried to shift culture before in the place where you work or in your family, it takes time. It took years for Katie to be able to say that in a place where I could receive it and where I can hear it. So don't give up on trying to make your home a Christ-centered culture. But when you do, you can work through every conflict that you'll ever face. No one is saying you cannot get angry with the people that you love, but in your anger, do not sin. The second, don't delay in dealing with your anger. The second part of verse 26, don't let the sun go down while you're still angry. You ever find yourselves in an argument with someone that you care about? And when you start to sense on the internal side that you are losing the argument, rather than concede, you know what, you won, you beat me fair and square, haha, we go back in time, we step on that transportation thing, we jump back in time to 4 months ago when you said you was going to take the trash out and you didn't. And I bring that from 4 months ago into today's argument and I say you did this and you always do that. Rather than deal with the conflict of today, we compound today's conflicts with conflicts of our past. We bring pieces back. Can I just offer, today's conflict is always strenuous. And yesterday's anger is a little bit dangerous. But last week's anger is poisonous. Oftentimes we think we have to win the argument. We make it a personal fight to make sure I come out on top. The more we add to today's conflict with conflict of our past is really a revelation that I haven't moved past the conflict of my past. And I'm trying to just make this relationship to where I'm the one in control and I control the emotions and the outcomes. And the reality is if we don't deal with the problems and the offenses of our past, we make our relationships for today more volatile than they should be. Rather than have hard conversations today, I act like I'm okay. I'm suppress my emotions. And after 2 or 3 or 10 conflicts that build up, well, then that one day I came home late from work, stressful day, or that one day I came home and I had a lot of extra homework. And I had that one day where someone was really kind of mean to me at work. And even though you didn't deserve any of what I'm about to bring to you, I'm going to explode on you with an anger that's been building up inside of me. Don't let the sun go down on your anger isn't some start the clock. You've got till 6:29 tonight to get this all settled out. It's more of a reality, a prompt. Don't let your anger go unnoticed. And don't let your anger go unapproached. The quicker we can talk about it, the less damage anger will do. Don't compound it. Let me just offer this grace-filled truth, and you can send me an email that I won't read later. If you find yourself bringing yesterday's anger into today's conflict, it's not very much to do with the person you're angry with. It's more to do with you. Cool. If we're bringing the conflict of our past into win today's arguments, it's really more about the problems inside of me than it is about the problems I have with you. Number 3, don't get angry quickly. James chapter 1, starting in verse 19, James gives this incredible advice. He says, you must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry. Why? Human anger does not produce the righteousness that God's desire. What's human anger? Let's start by defining what godly anger is. God is omniscient. God is omnipresent. Bible words, Christian words that mean God is all-knowing of all things, both past, present, and future. Simultaneously, God is everywhere all at the same time. We are human. We are in one place, at one time, with one perspective and one train of thought. Human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires because our human anger is often formed in the gaps of our life. Recognize omniscient, omnipresent, God has no gaps. Human anger is full of gaps. Human anger, we talked about this last week. One of the pillars of a solid, healthy relationship is the pillar of communication. You didn't take the trash out last week, and that made me angry. Are there any gaps in our story? Are there any gaps in our perspective? Maybe you intended to take the trash out and something came up that demanded your time, but I've just jumped right to assumption and anger. Did I take the time to inquire about the gaps? Did I consider that maybe your intent was right, but something else took you away from it? Maybe you forgot and you're lazy. Maybe my anger is justified, but we're not aware of all events all at the same time. We are in one place at one time. We don't know all things. And as a side note, It's amazing how diffusing and disarming clarifying questions can be in a conflict. When I'm not trying to catch you and trap you like the religious folks always did to Jesus, when I'm simply trying to get a fuller picture of where you are in your life when this happened. Well, Pastor, they got a history of not doing what I told them to do. Might be true. But if you want to build a culture in your home of grace-filled honesty, you can't jump right over the gap and get angry when you know they didn't do the thing you called them to do. We take time to ask questions, to clarify, to seek the truth. And it might be valid, your anger might be valid, but if we can just tone it down to have a conversation in honest, grace-filled truth. Let's jump back to Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 27 now. Paul writes, "For anger gives a foothold to the devil." Why do we have the don'ts? Because when we do the don'ts, anger gives a foothold to the devil. In the Greek where we get the word devil comes from the Greek word diablos, which in every commentary that I have, the first descriptor of the word diablos is the slanderer. When we talk honestly with each other, when we put off dealing with our anger and compress it and hold it down, when we get angry quickly, the first move that the devil makes in the conversation is to convince you that your spouse is worth slandering. To convince you to slander your kids, to slander your parents. The first time that anger starts to bubble up, the devil gets right in our thought pattern and he says, you know what? He is lazy. He doesn't provide for us. He's working all day long, but he comes home and does nothing. You know what? My parents always pick on me. I got 3 siblings and they never have to do any chores. My parents pick on me because they hate me. He's a slanderer. You know what? She be steady disrespecting me. That little teenager, you know what? Girl, I can't wait to have your own kids. He's a slanderer. What happens? While we make a case for why he is such a terrible husband, they're such a horrible parent or a horrible kid, what's happening is we're trying to allow the devil, diablos, a foothold. We're trying to allow the devil, maybe an easier way to say this in today's vocabulary, when we allow the devil to have a foothold in our life, we've hired him to be our relationship therapist. And he will slander every person in your life that God has placed in your life to grow you and develop you. Think about all those thoughts that you have. When anger stirs up and your thought life goes a little bit crazy, and you have all these thoughts against the love of your life, do you think those thoughts really came from God? When you have those thoughts that come up and man, you are so irritated that I'm not going to talk to them for 4 days. I'm going to give them the silence treatment and let them know how bad they hurt me. Do you think that that's really presented to you by the Holy Spirit? When mom and dad asks a chore of you, how dare they on your busiest day of the day? And you want to slander mom and dad. Is that really what Jesus meant when he said, honor your mother and father? The devil takes a foothold when we hire him to be our relational therapist and we believe the slanderous lies. I must have married the wrong person. Man, there is so much that needs to be changed in them. We are just no longer compatible. There must have been a mix-up in the delivery ward because that cannot be my kid. When we slander, we're taking advice from the devil. And it turns into things like, I'm not the problem, they're the problem. When we lay our head down at night and we're stewing on how angry we are at them. And that night turns into 2 or 3 nights where we can't sleep because we're stirring about what happens. When we start to see our spouse or our kids or our parents or our friends through the eyes of the devil, we slander them. If you think about it, Jesus said, here are the 2 greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with every part of your being and love your neighbor as yourself. If we're slandering them, we can't be loving them. If we're slandering them, there's a division that happens in our home. And as soon as we allow the devil a foothold to slander in our mind, it separates us emotionally from the people that God placed in our life intentionally. When you get angry, grace-filled honesty. When anger builds up inside of you, we have to talk this out. Pastor, what if I can't talk yet? What if I'm sleepy? And when I'm sleepy, no good comes from the conversation. Does this mean that I can't go to bed angry? You can go to bed angry. But don't make it a habit going to bed several nights in a row angry. The slanderer will get to you. Well, what if they're not ready to talk? I understand. And they might not be ready to talk yet. But the longer you wait to talk about it, the more damage the anger will do. The wide open door will continue to grow. The foothold will grow for the devil. So what do? This sounds kind of juvenile. We need to devil-proof our thoughts. Pastor, that sounds kind of silly. It's what Jesus did. I'm not talking about like getting some foil, making a tinfoil hat, like the devil can't get in my brain. No. Jesus came to devil-proof us from eternity. How did he do that? He came and forgave us. If you want to devil-proof your mind and your heart from the destructive patterns that he likes to do when he has a foothold through anger, then forgive the people that hurt you. If you want to devil-proof your mind of the hypercritical thoughts and the slanderous thoughts for your spouse, for your parents, for your kids, for your friends, forgive them. But they're wrong. Okay. You still get to forgive them. But what they did, what they said, it hurt me. Okay. No one's saying it didn't. But we still get to forgive them. Forgiveness does not concede that what they did to me was okay. Forgiveness simply releases them of the debt that I believe that they owe me for what they did to hurt me or the ones that I love. Because if you've lived long enough, you know that no amount of revenge will ever take away the pain of what happened. And unforgiveness is a disease that makes me want to give you poison that only impacts me. Anybody else ever sinned against God? And how did God respond? Well, he sent Jesus, his one and only perfect son, to die in my place. And if God could forgive them, better yet, if God could forgive me, then I can choose to forgive them too. Forgiveness doesn't just mean that I move on and go back to the way things were. It doesn't alleviate us from having hard conversations. If there's people that are in your home and you've had to forgive them, you still have to work towards hard conversations. But I refuse to give the devil a foothold. I refuse to allow him access to slander people in my mind and in my thought life because I will not allow the devil to be my relational therapist. I won't, so I don't. So then the flip side, what's the antidote? What's the biblical truth of how we do this? How do we address conflict? Reminder, Conflict Resolution Field Guide in your notes. It's a great resource, but the Bible gives some really simple, tangible steps. We got 4 of them we'll talk about real quick. The first one, be gentle. Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 1. A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. Wherever you start a conversation is where the conversation is going to live. If you start a conversation addressing some things that need to be talked about and you're super intense, it's going to remain super intense. If you start a conversation at a high volume, it's going to stay at a high volume. If you start a conversation by nagging and being condescending, you're going to have a fight. Wherever we start it, be gentle. Be gentle is not permission to skirt around the truth. Be gentle is an approach to be heard and to hear one another. Be gentle means we might not resolve the conflict before the first commercial break, but we'll resolve the conflict before the end of the episode. Be gentle puts us in a posture where we can hear and be heard. Be gentle with your words. Number 2, provide feedback, not frustration. Provide feedback, not frustration. Do you know what your problem is? You're always doing that. You never do this right. You are your father's child. What's it do? Frustration. Instant frustration, right? Back to Ephesians, this time verse 29. Paul continues, he says, don't use foul or abusive language. Let everything that you say be good and helpful, so your words will be an encouragement to those who hear. In fact, he continues on in verse 31. It says, get rid of all bitterness, all rage, all anger, all harsh words, and all slander. Feedback is, hey, I don't know if you know, but how you said this kind of hurt. Hey, I don't know if you know, you got up late for work or late for school, and in your frantic pace of trying to get ready, you said some things that were kind of mean, and it really hurt me a little bit. Feedback is to address what you did. You said this, you did this, and feedback, when received, is, I don't want to hurt you again. Feedback is, you know what, I'm sorry that happened. Feedback is hard to hear because oftentimes we take feedback personal. When we take feedback personal, it leads to frustration. Frustration comes from, I feel like you're just trying to blame me. Frustration comes from, I feel like you're just trying to point out all my faults. On our staff, we like to say this when we're getting feedback, when we're doing evaluations. Don't take feedback personal. It's in your notes. Feedback is all about what we do, not about who we are. The problem that we have with criticism, the problem that we have with evaluation, the problem that we often have with feedback is that we take it as though it's a personal attack on me. Feedback is not something we should fear. Feedback is something we should crave. If I've done something to hurt someone I love, please let me know so that I won't hurt you or continue the pattern of hurting you anymore. Feedback is understanding, look, there's some things that I could probably make some adjustments to. And if I can make those adjustments, we'd have a healthier relationship. Frustration is just when we tell the people, you're the problem. It's the way you are. We spend so much time trying to fix the person instead of providing feedback to a problem. Can I just offer, you and I can't fix people. Only Jesus can fix people. And we often get caught up in the weeds and in the mix of why we have such poor conflict resolution, because I want you to be a better you. Let me just break this down in a real way. When we talk through this whole concept of why do we not want to let the sun go down while we're still angry? Why do we not add from the different conflicts of our past? The reality is the two greatest commands, love the Lord your God with all you got and love your neighbor as yourself. If I'm making this about I don't like you, I'm angry at you. You're the problem I'm not loving. But when I can stop in my anger and recognize most of my anger is a result of what you did, not who you are, it totally changes the way I approach conflict resolution. You are not the problem. In fact, God put you in my life for a very specific reason. And in this season, I may not like you, but I love you. There's a reality to understand, like God brings people into our life to refine us, to make us more like Jesus. Not that we can change them. Only God can change someone. And I'm not against by any means. Pray for them. Pray for God to soften their heart. Pray for God to protect their mind. Pray for God to work in them. But if anyone that I would ever ask God to change, before I ask God to change anyone else, I ought to be asking God to change me. Where am I in the fault in this? Where do I have a gap in my perspective in this? Where am I missing the mark in this? God, there are plenty of parts of me that needs change, God. I'm going to start with this. Change my heart first. Number 3, lead with love. Lead with love. Whatever your home looks like, whether you're married with kids, maybe empty nester, maybe you got split custody, maybe you live alone, maybe you're a roommate, maybe you live with your parents still. Look, even if you're single, there will be conflicts in your home. In fact, it's kind of a terrifying concept when you have that conversation in your home alone with yourself. All right, nobody? Okay. 1 Corinthians. If you've ever been to a wedding before, there's a good chance you've heard this passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, starting in verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It's not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. Pastor, did you just put this verse in the Bible? Nope, it's been there. I just don't like to read it. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every through every circumstance. I tell people this often in pre-marriage counseling. If you want to have a healthy marriage, wherever you read the word love in this passage, replace it with your name. Luke is patient and kind. Luke is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. Luke does not demand his own way. Luke is not irritable. Only when reading this passage in third person does he get irritable. Luke keeps no record of wrong. If you want to see an improvement in the culture of your home, replace the word love with your name. And make sure you're living the Christ-centered culture in your home. When resolving conflict, lead with love. Last one, number 4, don't take your loved ones for granted. The closer we are to someone, the more likely we are to be in conflict with them. The more likely we are to take them for granted. Taking someone for granted is failing to properly appreciate them. The more comfortable we are with people, we see this playing out. The people that we live with, they get the wrath of our anger, even if they had nothing to do with it. They reap the wrath of our frustrations, even if they weren't involved in it. So I like to offer this. It's in your notes, and then I'll explain it. Loving relationships operate on the manna principle. You know the story of manna back in the book of Exodus? God leads through Moses his people out of slavery and captivity in Egypt. There's the 10 plagues, there's the parting of the Red Sea. Beautiful story of how God provides them escape and safety. And as he continues to provide for them, after some time, the Israelites, they get hungry, which made me realize this week that maybe hangry is actually a biblical context. Here's what happens. They get hungry and angry. Exodus chapter 16 and verse 3. Here's their response. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. They were slaves for hundreds of years, forced into labor, beaten, killed, executed, so many torturous things. And here's where they get hung up after they're hungry. If only the Lord would have killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. We sat around pots filled with meat, and we ate all the bread that we wanted. But now he brought us out here into the wilderness to starve us to death. I just read that because that's how the teenagers sound in my house. Never mind. Verse 4. This is how God responds. Then the Lord said to Moses, look, which if I was God, tone would be different. Look! That's why I'm not. I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you. Each day, give specific instruction. Each day, the people can go out and pick up as much food as they need for that day. I will test them to see whether or not they're going to follow my instructions. So much goodness in here. God's promise, I will provide for you every day what you need, but you got to do some work. Only gather the manna that you're going to eat that day. Now, trust me, I'll provide more tomorrow. Trust that I'll be your provider, just like he's always promised. Trust is simple, just follow my instructions. Your marriage operates on the manna principle. Your relationship with your kids operates on the manna principle. Your relationship with your friends operates on the manna principle. Here's where we make the mistake. If you keep reading verse 20. But some of them didn't listen, and they kept some of the manna until morning. But then it was full of maggots and had a terrible smell. Love is a perishable commodity. Today's love will not survive on what you stored up yesterday. Married people, we already know this. The points you worked so hard for yesterday, they reset when you went to sleep tonight. And when you got up this morning, it was a start over. The love that you displayed to your children yesterday, it will not sustain them today. Yesterday's love was good for yesterday, but it will not provide you the relational nutrition you need for today. Every day is a new day to work, to build, and better trust. Every day is a new day, a new opportunity to improve your levels of communication. Every day is a new day full of potential to implement forgiveness. When the credits roll at the end of the scene or at the end of the day, a new episode begins the next day. And the new episode, just like the sitcoms, will present new opportunities, new challenges, and new conflicts. But God didn't give us relationships to make us happy. He puts us in relationships to make us more holy. The people that you are in relationship with, that God ordained in your home, in your family, in your friend circle, God knew that they would push you and have conflict with you and refine you and sharpen you. And he offers his peace by the end of the episode. A peace that only he can offer. And my encouragement to you today is to seek his peace. It's not this tranquil feeling that makes you sleep good at night. It's an understanding and the security that God will provide again tomorrow. Let me pray with you. God, we're grateful. We're grateful that you sent your advocate, the Holy Spirit, to us, that we might know the peace of Jesus Christ in every area of our life. That in the conflicts we experience, God, help us to see that there are gaps to the story. And God, help us to have compassion for people like Christ did. In the times where forgiveness is hard, God, help us to be a people that can willingly release the debt that I believe you owe to know what real healing through forgiveness feels like. In those moments where things seem so intense, God, give us the wherewithal to walk away, to take a pause, to not say the hurtful things, but to be gentle with our words. God, help us to be a people that are coming more and more to be like Jesus than ever before. We thank you for that gift. In Jesus' name.